Hello and welcome to Releasing Your Inner Dragon, where story creators talk about story creation. Your hosts are Maxwell Alexander Drake, who, in addition to teaching creative writing around the world, is an award-winning novelist and former lead fiction writer for Sony's EverQuest Next. He's also written for other game properties like Shadowrun, written comic books, stage plays, musicals, sold movie scripts, and is currently producing an animated TV show that he's written and directed titled Gods. And Marie Mullaney, author of Songwheel Chronicles and YouTuber of the fantasy world-building channel Just in Time Worlds. We hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, let's talk about narrative perspective. So I have been reading your book, and I
Which
was
one?
very dynamic story creation.
Okay.
And one of the interesting things that you spoke about there was the narrative perspective. Now, I have to say that some of it is a little, so my English is very good, but it's not my native language.
Right.
So I have not always got a fully comprehensive grasp on grammar, on the finer points of grammar. So it was very interesting to me to read some of that perspective in terms of the deeper grammatic voice of English. But won't you just walk us through the different narrative perspectives?
Well, I don't even do all of them in the book because there's just so many.
Sure.
But we can definitely talk about them and do on them. But I do want to actually, I want to take a step back. One of the things that excited me about doing this podcast for you is you're not in America.
Yeah.
You're in Finland,
Yeah.
born and raised, and I'm a born and raised American.
Well,
and so
I'm living in Finland. I'm actually
Oh.
born and raised in South Africa.
Oh,
Yeah.
even better.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that I really loved about this, because writing is about multiple perspectives. It's about, it's the human. So one of the things that I teach about theme is the only requirement for somebody to understand a theme is that they were born human.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what sex they are, what religion they are, what political view they are, what country they were born in, what language they speak. Thematic elements, like if we talk about the perils of greed, I don't care where you're from.
Yeah.
You're going to get the message of the story. And so that's why we say it's the humanizing principle, because it transcends sex and race and culture and society and everything else.
All of those things.
However, English it's a very weird language, especially American English, which is pop culture. We were the creators of pop culture, you could say, or not the creators. I mean, you can go back into the Grimm fairy tales and, all sorts of crazy stuff if you go into the past. But modern day pop culture pretty much comes from America.
From America.
We are this. And so if you're wanting to get into that mass market, you really kind of need to be in. So my first protege, and he's actually one of the writers on The Realm, is actually British.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that we worked on, that he really wanted to work on, he's like, look, I don't want any British English in my writing. I want American English. And it's because it's so much more widely accepted, especially in America. Yeah. So it's crazy. And so the reason I want to go down this, and I just looked this up, that's what I was typing. Most Americans don't even know the rules to stuff.
Yeah.
And it literally is because from the time of birth, we've been hearing. So like one of the things that almost no American knows is that there's an actual order to how you should write adjectives. And they don't even realize this. They just think that's you're just going to describe this noun, so you're just going to put a bunch of shit in front of it. But the reality is it's quantity or number, quality or option, size, age, shape, color, and then a proper adjective such as nationality or origin or material, whatever, and then the purpose or the qualifier. Nobody knows that rule in America, not one single American. Because if I said the old little lady, to me as an American, that's wrong. It just
Yeah.
sounds wrong to us.
Yeah.
But it's why so many foreigners who come over here will say things out of order to us because we don't even know that the rule exists. So it's always the little old lady, because old little lady sounds wrong. But when you look at the thing, the third is size, the fourth is age. So it's little old lady. That's the rule.
Yeah.
But a lot of people that don't speak English natively, they will mix up the order of things or whatever. I was reading a story, a self-published thing just this morning. Someone sent it to me, so it was only a couple of paragraphs because they wanted me to kind of comment on it. And they were expecting me to comment on it one way. And I wrote them back and I said, well, this is obviously written by somebody who doesn't speak, because they were trying to pick on the grammar. And I was like, no, I'm not going to pick on the grammar. This person obviously doesn't speak English natively. And they don't even have the grasp of English at the level that you do. So like it's still very new to them. And I'm like, no, I'm not gonna talk about how bad this grammar is. And you shouldn't either. Like, this is a person, it's like, you know, if I wrote a story in French or Finnish or whatever, like, you should never, I would be horrible because I don't speak any of those languages. No. So it's
I would be amazed if you wrote a story in Finnish. It is a rough language to learn.
Well, I've already told you this joke, but I'll tell it to the audience. This is one of my favorite jokes. So if you can speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you can speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. If you can speak 1 language, you're American. So I'm American. So that's, and the reason why I bring this up is if English is your native language, if you were born and raised in America, you don't know grammar well enough to be a professional writer. If it isn't your native language, you also probably don't know. Although most people that speak really great English that are not native Americans actually have a much better grasp than Americans. Americans, because we don't push it and we don't, you know, when they step up to trying to write professionally, they fail in so many different ways. And that's a lot of my teaching goes into that, because what I'm actually teaching is I'm teaching my American counterpart writers, you've got to learn English. What you know is not correct. And when you read it, it's very annoying. You know, if you know, obviously no one's going to write the old little lady, but they do filter and mix the tenses on their participles and have tells and all this other stuff because they write the way they talk. Yeah. And while it's fine verbally to hear that or auditorily to hear that stuff, it is a nightmare to read. Yeah. And I love this as an example. So I'm in the script for this TV show Guards. One of the guys, they're both fantasy, so it's kind of a British kind of way of talking. It really isn't. It's kind of my own. It's almost a mix between British, Australian, and my own kind of weird kind of way, because I want it to be fantasy, but I don't want it to be like Cockney or whatever. And I did have that, like I just finally cast the last actor, and when he was doing the audition, he was doing Cockney, and I was like, no, it's and so I had to actually coach him through it, and he nailed it. The reality is that you can't write the way you talk, because you know, we talk in weird ways. So like, people are reading my scripts, my other writer friends are reading the script, and they're prose writers, they're novelists. And so they dock me on, like, there's this thing where the guard, every single one of them circled this and goes, oh, you can't write it like this. This is terrible. And it is when you read it, because when you read it, it says, did you know that blah, blah, blah. And so like, when you read that, it's horrible to read. But I'm like, huh?
It works if you talk.
But that's what I said. I said, you're not hearing it, dude. This is a script. So no one reads any of this. So the reality is it's the old guard. And he goes, did you know that blah, blah, blah? Like, when you say it, there's no problems with it at all. Yeah. So you have to, not only do you have to learn as a prose writer that you cannot write the way you talk, you also, if you are going to do like me and write in multiple mediums, you have to understand the advantages and disadvantages of those. Because like in prose, I would never write, did you know, blah, 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 because that's the way you'd read it. Did you know, blah, blah, blah. Oh my God, why did I just read that twice? Like, it's so annoying.
And that is why Cursed Child was freaking terrible, and why the new Harry Potter movies, somebody needs to explain very nicely to the billionaire lady that in fact she is not a playwright.
Yeah, that's a minefield. I'm not going to step in. There are too many fanatical Harry Potter fans out there.
I love the books. Don't get me wrong. Like, I love Harry Potter books. I think they're great books. I waited in line for those books to hit the bookstores.
Me too.
You know, because I was that kind of age. Like, I loved them. And I still do. I still reread them. She is not a playwright.
It's tough. And maybe one day we should do. So most professional writers can only write in one medium. They really struggle to write in other mediums. And I'm an award-winning novelist. I've written for video games. I've written comic books, stage plays, musicals, movies, and TV now. So, and it is because, you know, I say I only speak one language. Actually, I speak 7 languages, because every one of those mediums to me is a completely new language.
Yeah.
And so when I get into it and I really study it, the reason why I'm a great script writer is because it's a different language. I don't write. And that was actually, you know, it took me some time. It took me a couple of years to really kind of understand, because there's a lot different. But anyway, we don't want to go into it here. But that's something maybe.
But that's exactly it, right? Is like a great prose writer, not necessarily going to be a great movie writer.
Right. Yeah, 100%. I mean, Kirkman is a great example of that going the other way. You know, he wrote Invincible and The Walking Dead, both the comic series and a lot of the TV episodes. I love him as a scriptwriter. I've got a couple of his novels, and they're tough. Like, they are terrible prose, just horrible prose. And it's because he just doesn't have that. I'm
pretty convinced that Shakespeare would have been terrible if he tried to write prose.
We're going to find out. No, I have never admitted this publicly. This is a secret little project.
Okay.
And I've been working on it for years, and it's way on the back burner, but I'm actually rewriting some of the Shakespeare plays as novels in full prose.
Well, that's not Shakespeare's prose, though. I mean, you know, we will never know if Shakespeare was any kind of novelist, but I'm willing to bet that he would have been a terrible novelist, because he understood the stage. He understood.
Most people are when you move from one medium to another. Yeah. It's difficult. And I didn't know how difficult until I started, because my only beta readers are all novelists.
Yeah.
So when I started writing scripts and I would send the scripts to these people, they were freaking lost. They were like, I don't understand it. What is this? Like, this is terrible. Well, I remember, so Guards is an offshoot of a cartoon that I want to sell called Fiend Folly. And you can find it about, if you go to fiendfolly.com, you can see some animation that I did and get a little bit of it. But the pilot script that I wrote, I sent it to a lot of my writer friends, and the opening scene I think is hilarious. It's 3 minutes long, and it's just phenomenally hilarious for an epic fantasy fan. And every single one of them were like, I don't understand. This is dumb. I don't understand. This is not funny at all. And so I actually did a mock-up animation of it, just a little 3-minute, really crappy art. I voice acted everything myself. And I just did it. And I showed it to them, and they were like, oh my God, this is hilarious. Why didn't you write it this way in the script? And I'm like, it's literally written exactly that way, word for word. How do you not see that? So it's weird, you know, now when somebody, especially a writer friend or somebody I know from the writer world, is like, oh my God, I'd love to read your kids' movie. I always have to go, okay.
See, my mother, I guess one of the reasons why my English is so good is my mother taught English. Not English at school level, English at university level. There's always been English books in the house. And my father was not English, is not English. And I didn't speak English at school or anything like that, but I grew up with a lot of English. And her favorite author included Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. So I actually read Shakespeare's plays before I ever saw them performed, which is why I can make pictures in my head when I read a script, which is why I could read Cursed Child, the released script, and see it, but it still wasn't a good play comparative to, like, well,
Right.
okay, that's also not a fair comparison. The problem is whenever I read a script, I take it back to like Shakespeare's scripts, which you can read. And
So what you're saying is that Rowling isn't Shakespeare. That's what
Rowling isn't Shakespeare. She which I really, that's not a fair comparison. I mean, how many Shakespeares are born?
We are being humorous.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
so the reason why I went down all that path with the grammar and everything like that, not only to stress, if you're going to write in any medium, frickin' learn grammar, study grammar. It's the tool of a writer. If you don't know grammar, you can't write. But the other thing is to say, and it dovetails into exactly the warning that I had about thematical elements. We consume this stuff so much as an English speaking, culture. You're watching all the same movies I'm watching, even though we're literally on opposite sides of the globe. We have the same streaming services. We have the same, all this stuff. And so we as a culture, as an earth human culture, are consuming all this entertainment and all these, different things. And that's great. But the danger is when you don't study it and you don't understand it from that level. So just like with a thematic element, when you go down that path where you don't pick your theme and push your theme through your story, it's the same thing with narrative tense or narrative style, whatever words you want to use for this. Case in point, I meet a lot of people at writers' conferences that are writing a YA post-apocalyptic story. And I'll go, oh, I noticed, well, let me step back. First of all, whenever I meet a new writer and they tell me about their story, one of the first questions that I love asking is I go, oh, what point of view did you write it in?
Yeah.
And the crazy thing to me is about 10% of the people that I ask that question to. Now, remember, they spent a year or more writing this novel that they're about to pitch to an agent.
Yep.
About 10 to 15% of them will go, what do you mean? And I'm like, point of view. Did you write it in first person, second person, third person? And they're like, I don't know what that means. And that blows my mind. That blows my mind that any percent of a person who wrote 80,000 words, 100,000 words, doesn't know the difference between first person and third person. That blows my mind. But it's small, 10% or so. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. The 80 to 90% of the people who answer that question, and they'll do it. Oh, I wrote it in first person. Oh, I wrote it in third person. My next question, no one has ever answered. Not one single new author that I've asked has ever answered this question. My follow-up question, when they go, oh, I wrote it in third person, or I wrote it in first person. My follow-up question is, why? Why did you use that point of view to write that story? And they all go, what? Because here's the thing about the narrative style that you choose, and that includes point of view, that includes who the narrator is, that includes, all these other different choices, which I talk about in my the point of view book. All of those impact the reader. All of those impact the delivery of the story. And every one of those have advantages and disadvantages that will help some stories and hurt other stories. So going back to what I was saying, every time I meet somebody who's writing a young adult post-apocalyptic story, I go, what POV did you write it in? And they go, oh, first person present tense. And I say, why? And they go, because Hunger Games was written in that tense. Hunger Games. So first of all, first person has the most disadvantages of all the POVs. And I'm talking about first person and third person. I'm not including second person, obviously. And then of the two tenses,
second person is like what? The choose your own adventure books, because that's the only example I can think of.
Kind of. I've had one book published or one story published in second person in my entire career. It was a short story. And I did it for a very sadistic reason. It's you in a hotel room here in Vegas in 2012, because that's when it was published. Yeah. And you're listening to a tape recording that was made in 1983, where two guys are talking about an event that happened to one of them in 1953.
Okay.
So even though it's written in second person, I kind of cheated because it's only in second person for the first couple of paragraphs,
Yeah.
a couple of paragraphs in the very middle of it, and the last couple of paragraphs. The rest of it is technically written in first person because it's a tape that these two guys were talking.
Yeah.
And so most of it is written in that, but I did it for a sadistic reason because I wanted the reader to kill themselves at the end of the story. And so you put a gun to your head. It is ambiguous. You don't know whether you die from something else because something is about to horribly kill you. And so you don't know if you actually killed yourself or if you died in a horrible way. But either way, it was a very sadistic thing. I wanted to kill my reader. But that's the only. So yeah, second person is not something that's usually going to be done in fiction. It has been done, but it's tough. It's definitely not a point of view that most readers are going to cater to. But when we look at Hunger Games, so first of all, first person is the most limited of the POVs because third person has way more advantages than disadvantages, where first person has way more disadvantages than advantages. But when we look at the two narrative tenses, and there's only two narrative tenses to write in, you can write in past tense or present tense. And every time I say that, some person will raise their hand in my class and go, but there's also future tense narratives. And I'm like, yes, there are future tense verbs, but you can't write a story in future tense. You can't write a story where the prince will one day rescue the princess because then nothing happens. You can't write that story. So really you're straddled with two narrative tenses, present tense or past tense. And present tense is way more limited because it actually excludes you from writing almost half of the verb forms that exist. And I know I'm getting very grammarly here. And if I'm saying out these terms or whatever, and you don't know what these are, you need to Google. Like if I say verb forms and you're like, I don't know what that is, then obviously you need to Google that. So when you combine the most limited POV as far as first person with an even more limiting present tense verb form, you are literally straddling your story with the most limitations. Why does Hunger Games work? Because the story doesn't have anything that brushes up against those disadvantages. If you're a Hunger Games fan, you're going to be mad at me for saying this, but it is the most simplistic story you can write. And I'm talking about from a structure standpoint. Every time I say that, they're like, oh no, the world is so complex. World building has nothing to do with story structure. No. From a story structure standpoint, it is a single character that starts in a single moment in time and moves linearly forward until a single point at the end. That's it. There's no side nothing. There's no multiple plots. There's no multiple characters. There's from a structural standpoint, it doesn't get more simplistic than Hunger Games. So therefore, having the most limited POV written in the most limited narrative tense does not negatively impact it. But if I just spoke for the last 10 minutes and you're like, holy crap, I didn't know any of this stuff, this is the point of this discussion. Yeah. If you don't make the decision of which tense to write in, then it's made for you. And if you do it accidentally and you're writing a story that needs something else or needs this or whatever, then the narrative style that you choose is going to freaking break you. It's going to break your story. It's going to cause you all sorts of complications. It is the reason why epic fantasy pretty much across the board, adventure fantasy can get away with first person, but epic fantasy is third person past tense because those are, and there are examples that are outside of that, but they are very few and far between, and they're not.
So I'll mention two that I know of that are in first person. The one is
now, are these adventure fantasy?
So epic. So Jacqueline Carey writes in first person. Yeah. And her books are epic fantasy, but I will say that she does, each book is a story, and the three stories form an arc.
See, that seems more adventure fantasy to me.
Yeah, but it is, I mean, the scope of it is epic. The overarching scope is epic.
Now, are you so maybe we should define at least my definition of adventure fantasy versus epic fantasy.
Sure.
Epic fantasy is going to be a story that's going to have multiple point of view characters running multiple different story arcs with multiple different motivations across multiple different regions. So
So
You know,
I'm
even,
with you, except that I think that you can write it from one character perspective. I don't think you
and again,
have to have,
that's more what I classify as adventure
yeah,
fantasy. Again, these are just my
yeah.
definitions. There's no real official
No, there isn't. It's all just, it's
definition.
marketing genre. So,
Right.
so for me, epic fantasy is multiple stories with multiple themes. It has more scope than one novel.
And it has to be laced together through it. So
Yeah.
like if she's writing a story that has one character with one theme in one story and tying it up, and then another story that's kind of the same way.
No, no, no. So,
I
no, 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 no. So these are, it's the same point. It's the same first person narrator through all three books. And each book, the first book stand alone, but it leads into the second book. The second book cannot stand without the first book. You'll be lost if you
that's
try and
fine.
read book, you know. And book three, the conclusion to it all, she's got this very nice rhythm where the first book is an adventure story, the second book is a political plot, and the third book is like the mystery and the epic and the magic side of things. It's actually a very cool little like structure. But overall, it tells this massive narrative. But yes, it is not like a Jordan or a Martin style of
Right.
epic fantasy, right? The other epicish, although it's classified more as urban fantasy, is Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden files, which definitely now I would count as epic fantasy with very many plots, lots of things.
Right.
But
And he
every
did,
book is a narrative in and of itself with its own conclusion, its
right.
own, yeah.
And Butcher's a great example to study on this topic that we're talking about. We're off topic of what we were
Yes.
talking about, but the first Dresden book is fine for a first novel,
Yep.
but it is definitely not great.
No.
And the coolest thing about reading Butcher is watching him grow as a writer and just become so much stronger,
Yeah.
and so much more understanding. And so and Rowling was really the same way, although I do believe the first Harry Potter book was a hell of a lot stronger first book than
Yep.
the first in the Dresden series.
I agree.
But she also did the same thing where she expanded the world and started, I mean, by the seventh book, you are following multiple characters, and
Yeah.
it is much more epic in scope. And so, I guess that's, and again, there is no such real definition as adventure fantasy or epic fantasy or anything like that. This is really, you're right, it's a marketing construct,
Yeah.
but it's a marketing construct for a reason.
Yeah.
Like, it's so funny, the last 15 years of touring as a professional author, almost every convention that I have done, I will have somebody come up to my booth and they'll go, "Oh, I read that book." And I'm like, "Oh, really? How'd you like it?" And I didn't like it at all. And I'm like, it's so weird to me that you came out of your way, like you were just walking by and saw my posters and all that, and had to stop to tell me that you didn't like like, that's a weird human trait for me. Again, going back to I live life trying to not ever negatively impact people. That's a foreign concept to me, to go up to somebody and say, "Oh, that thing you just spent your life doing, it sucks." Like, it's just a weird thing. But because of who I am, I never like, "Oh, well, screw you," or take it personally. I always started asking questions, and I figured out really quickly. I would go, "So do you like Robert Jordan or Brandon Sanderson or George Martin or Joel Rosenberg?" And they'll be like, "No, I don't like any of those authors. They're all terrible, just like you." And then I'll go, "Do you like Terry Brooks or David Eddings or Terry Goodkind?" They're like, yeah, those guys are great." And then I would go, "Okay, so you are an adventure fantasy fan. Stop buying epic fantasy books because you're not going to like any of them." It's the same way with me with music. If I am passing by a restaurant that is playing country music, my eyes will start bleeding a little bit. Like, I cannot stand country music. It is horrible. But I would never buy a country music song and then much less review a country music song, because I know I hate it. And so I tried to educate them with a little bit of, "Hey, so you're reading the wrong genre. It's like, if you don't like romance, then don't read romance, because you're never going to like it."
Yeah. No, and I mean, that's absolutely true. But to get back to the narrative thing, you can do epic fantasy, I think, in first person. But
No,
you gotta be doing a very specific story.
Right. It has to. So my definition of epic fantasy, I don't think you can. So I'm friends with call him Pat. And I just
Patrick Rothfuss.
Rothfuss, thank you. I don't know why I just blanked on his name. So Name of the Wind is a great book.
Yeah.
However, it was a tough read for me because he does write in both first person and third person in the book. And I get his decision for it. First person is the hero, third person is everyone else.
Yeah.
So I get that.
It's weird though.
It's weird. It's just
Not gonna lie, it's weird.
It takes a while to get used to that weird hard switch. Now, I think he did it pretty well. Yeah. Somebody who did kind of the same thing that I think was an abysmal failure was Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer. Because at least in Name of the Wind, you have an entire chapter from the hero's perspective, so it's in first person. And then that chapter frickin' ends. And then you have an entire chapter or a couple chapters from other people's perspectives, and they're all in third person, and then they frickin' end. In Enter the Vampire, you're reading along in third person, and then without any change other than the next paragraph. There's no indent, there's no nothing. You're just in first person.
Yeah, no.
And then without any warning, you're just back in third person again.
No.
And it is so jarring and so broken that it was one of the toughest reads. I think the toughest read that I ever did was The Wives of Los Alamos. And it's not in my genre because it's chick lit, but I read it because of what it was. And it's actually published by the publisher who published Harry Potter over in England.
Okay.
But that author made up her own frickin' narrative style. It's written in first person plural.
We.
So it starts off, and I'll just paraphrase, but it starts off, we were in our kitchen when we heard the car pull up. We wiped our hands off on the dish rag and went in to see who it was. Our husbands were sitting in their favorite chair.
Ow, ow,
like,
ow, ow,
the
no.
whole book is written that way.
No.
And it's insane to read.
Yeah.
When we get into narrative style, and the reason why I brought that up, and same thing with everything else. One of the things, and this, I'm going to dovetail this into a topic that is not the same, but it's still similar. So one of the things that I hate when I run into with the self-published crowd, and me and you have talked about this offline, not that you're doing it, I'm just saying we discussed it, is when self-published authors decide to use their own frickin' formatting style. Like, I have seen people that use parentheses for dialogue. All their dialogue, every single one of them is in parentheses. I've seen the craziest stuff. Yeah. And standardized formatting is not for the writer. It is for the reader. The reason why we use dialogue tags, quotes, for dialogue is because that lets the reader know without saying anything that the next words are going to be said out loud. So in your mind, imagine them being said, so that I don't have to write. And then Drake forcing air out of his lungs through his voice box to produce sound said out loud, blah, 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 blah. I can just put, quote, blah, 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 blah.
And it is, you are writing for the reader.
Right.
So you are not writing because you think it's pretty. You are writing for somebody else to consume. So I want to answer your question about what narrative style you picked, because I picked third person past tense, because one, I'm writing in the past tense because I don't like a present tense style. I feel it's too limiting.
It is. It cuts out half the verb forms.
Yeah. But I chose to write in a third person style, despite the fact that my story structure, at least for the first novel, is simple, because of my hats. Now, you've read far enough to encounter the hats, but my main character changes his face and his personality by switching hats. And
brilliant.
Writing, thank you.
My favorite part of it so far.
Writing that in a first person narrative would be impossible, because I have to distinguish by name who the main character currently is. Is it?
So you change your main character's name
Louis,
with these new
Leno.
personalities.
Yes. And each one of those is a distinctive personality with a distinctive hat, a distinctive profession. And so third
So let me
person was
explain.
my only choice.
Well, let me explain why. Let me explain why your choice is so good.
Yeah.
Because a lot of writers will argue with me on this. They'll go, oh, but I can have multiple point of view characters and still write them all in first person.
No, you can't.
Technically, you can, because you can do anything.
Sure, you can.
You can also use species to write your book if you want.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it's the right choice. Just saying you can do it if you choose to do it.
Sure.
Just don't send me a copy, please. But here's the thing about first person, and the reason why it needs to be in a story that has one character from start to finish. So Harry Potter, the first book, has Harry. He's the only narrating POV. He's it. It's written in third person.
Yeah.
And it's because I think she knew she was going to expand it later. And so it's tough to start in one POV and then even in another book of the same series, expect your readers to follow that. So here's the thing about first person. And one of the reasons why it's so awesome when used correctly, it literally puts you inside of that character, that narrating character. You're in their thoughts, you're in their head, you're in their mind, you're in their body. You're experiencing their world from their perspective. Mm-hmm. The problem is that when you switch to another first person narrator, mm-hmm. all the work you've done creating this illusion that the reader is this person, you now have to break and create another illusion of another person to be in.
Yeah.
Actually, the funny thing is you talked about past tense. 1 in 8 readers refuse to read, and it might be less now. This was 5 years ago when I saw this statistics, or maybe 6 years ago now. But back then, 1 in 8 readers would not read a book written in past tense.
Okay.
And I'm like, wait, if I'm going to spend a year writing a novel, I don't want to lose 1 in 8 of my readers just because I chose to write in a tense.
Yeah.
That's out. And I'm talking about fantasy readers. And again, other genres, young adult is way, they're much more used to it all and all that. But in the fantasy genre, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, the statistics were 1 in 8 would not even buy it. So I don't want to lose the present tense stories. Like with you and your hats and your multiple personalities, you would literally be breaking that illusion every time you wanted to change. And sometimes they change in, a couple times in a scene. Yeah. So that would be horrible on the reader to have them have to go, oh, I'm this other person now, and I'm this other person. And third person, and again, that's why it's so important to learn the advantages and disadvantages of all these different narrative styles. Third person, the advantage is that it allows you to seamlessly move from characters to characters, not within the same scene. That's called head hopping. That is something different. Yeah. But to scene break or to do a new chapter and then move into a new character. We have been telling stories that way for 7,000 years. We are conditioned as readers to accept that. It is the advantage of first person. And so it is this flawless kind of way of doing these multiple characters. And so you just want to make sure that you're thinking about that and thinking about the type of story that you're doing. But it gets even more detailed than that. Like when you get into tenses, one of the biggest problems with present tense is, again, it cuts out your verb form. So you don't have you can use future tense verbs, but it breaks the illusion of present tense. You can use past tense verbs, but it breaks the illusion that you've created with present tense. The beautiful thing about past tense is one of its advantages is you can use present tense and future tense flawlessly without. So I've literally in one paragraph in a fight scene, I've gone from, and that's the other thing that I guess I should say. A lot of people are like, well, I want to write in present tense so it feels like it's being written now. Past tense, if you write it in an immersive, showy way, feels like it's happening now, even though it's written in past tense. Yes. So in a fight scene in one paragraph, I can literally shift, and it's time manipulation with your verb forms. And I can shift from the past tense now to a past tense from a long time ago, to a present tense, to a future tense, and back to the past tense of now. Yeah. And it literally is seamless, and the audience isn't thrown out. And even though I'm moving back and forth and shifting in time, the audience stays with it and understands. Like the example I use, there's this one scene where I had a guy draw a sword, and it's the first time I've introduced his sword. So he whips it out because he's getting attacked by these people. And, it says, and I'm paraphrasing because this has been a while since I've written it, but he whips it out and it says, Jiroshi, that was the name of the sword. Jiroshi gleamed in the moonlight. Never had he found its equal, made from the special metal and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get into world building. But he's, made from the special metal 5,000 years ago. He had never sharpened it. Like, I literally, in the paragraph that he whips the sword out, I go back in time 5,000 years and then come right back and kill the guys that he's fighting. And like, it's so flawless that nobody is jerked out of the story and go, oh my God, why are we 5,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Whereas when you're in that those limitations of first person, especially when you add in the extra limitations of present tense, you start trying to do time manipulation, you really hurt. But again, we look at Hunger Games, never needed to do that. Starts now, goes forward, ends there. Done.
But Hunger Games is written to be that way, right? As you said,
it's a story.
It's a linear.
That's perfect for that.
Yeah.
So
if that's not what you're writing, don't pick that. Like,
well, and see, that's the thing.
If you don't yet know what you're writing, start in third person past tense, because that's probably going to be what you should end up doing.
It's definitely the most common in all genres. So definitely in fantasy, it's like 80%. So it is the vast majority of readers are very used to that third person past tense. Yeah. It's strong. It has the least amount of weaknesses. Now, we can also get into the fact that there are dozens of types of third person. I actually teach 4 different types. So like we can keep going on and on and on about all these different things that you have to think about. And again,
start calling today's episode.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely not going to do it. And really, I mean, if you want to get into point of view and narrative tense and all of that, my Better Writing Through Stronger Narrative book is 80,000 words of just this, literally what we've talked about over these last maybe 45 minutes.
And I'm about halfway through and can genuinely recommend it. So
yeah, it's very much in depth.
Yeah.
But these are things you need to know. I mean, these are things that to be a professional writer is vitally important, because again, just to circle back around to the very beginning of this, the problem with this is if you don't make the decision, the decision still gets made.
Yeah.
It's just
still going to happen.
Yeah. So hopefully that's what we're going to discuss on this podcast. And we're going to go through and we're going to talk a lot about world building. We're going to talk a lot about writing. We're talking about a lot about story and structure and everything else. But really it's about, I think the biggest danger for aspiring writers is not knowing what they don't know. So, I've already said this, but I'll reiterate, if terms were thrown out today that you're like, I don't know what that is. We live in the information age. Yeah, Google it. Like, that's just the way it is. Or buy my books or buy other books that are on this topic. I read a creative writing book every single month. I've been professionally writing for 15 years. I've been writing full, myself for 30 years. There isn't a year that goes by that I don't read some book on craft, some book on grammar, some book on whatever. It's just, I'm in a constant state of trying to learn more and more and more and more, because it's a never ending journey as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully that's what we're going to be doing in this podcast. And hopefully you'll follow us as we go through this, because it's really exciting stuff if you're into it. It's really boring stuff if you're not. But, if you're going to be a professional at this, you have to act like a professional. You have to be a professional. Like, I don't want, and I talk about this in dynamic story creation, where I tell a story about a surgeon, because that's what I feel. I feel like, I'm a surgeon in the craft of writing. And I wouldn't want to go to a doctor who didn't go to medical school and didn't have any knowledge and didn't read any books on the subject and is just like, oh, but it's fine, I still have a scalpel. Yeah, you're called a serial killer. You're not called a surgeon. And so I don't want to be a serial killer as a writer. I don't want to just puke words on the page and expect it to be good. I want to spend that time learning this stuff. So hopefully you'll join us on this journey and we'll open your eyes about some crazy things that you may not have even heard about.
And that is our aim for Releasing the Dragon. And we'll catch you for the next one.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, you will probably like Marie's YouTube channel, Just in Time Worlds, and Drake's courses on creative writing that he offers through Drake U. So make sure to check those out, and we will be back next week for another episode.